They laughed. My parents, both of them. They had waited their entire lives for this moment. My name is Rowan Ellis. I'm 36 years old, a financial abuse attorney living in Boston. For most of my life, I was the daughter they never wanted the wrong shape for their perfect picture. I didn't follow the rules. I didn't chase status. I didn't become the version of me they could show off at country clubs and board meetings. And that made me disposable. That's why when the lawyer read the will that morning, they couldn't contain themselves. The smirk spread across the room like a virus. My father's thin, polished lips curved into a grin of pure satisfaction. My mother raised one perfectly sculpted eyebrow, covering her mouth like it was some sort of private joke. Only they understood. To Rowan Ellis, the lawyer said, pausing just enough to let the tension build, "I leave the sum of $10. $10. The words dropped into the room like a stone in still water. There was a moment, just one, of stunned silence. Then the first chuckle, then another. The room filled with smirk snickers and the kind of laughter that cuts straight through bone. "Guess that's what happens when you don't play the game," my father muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. I didn't say a word. I sat there perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap. But inside my heart was hammering so hard I thought it might break through my chest. My cheeks burned, but my spine stayed straight. I had promised myself I would not cry. Not here. Not in front of them. I looked around the table. The polished faces of cousins I barely spoke to. My older brother Miles already texting under the table, barely registering my humiliation. My mother, her red nails tapping the edge of the armrest in that delicate way of hers. My father shaking his head in mock pity. I had always known I was the outsider in my own bloodline. But this made it official. The lawyer, Mr. O. Crane adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat. The room hushed again. "Actually," he said carefully, his voice steady but soft, "there's a confidential letter. Only for Rowan." Every eye snapped to him, then to me. My father's grin faltered. My mother's fingers froze mid-tap. Even Miles looked up. The room that had been full of laughter just seconds before now shifted into something else entirely. Suspicion, confusion, a flicker of fear. I swallowed hard. My palms were damp. But I met Mr. Crane's eyes and nodded. And then everything changed. I could feel the weight of their stares as I stood. My shoes clicked against the marble floor as I followed Mr. Crane down the hallway into a small adjoining office. The air was cooler there, the world quieter. On the desk sat a cream-colored envelope. My name Rowan, written in delicate sloping handwriting I recognized instantly, my grandfather's. That envelope, that letter. It would unravel everything I thought I knew about my family, about legacy, about who I really was. And though I didn't know it yet, it would also set in motion the kind of revenge that doesn't need raised voices or bloodshed to cut deeper than any blade. Because sometimes the sharpest weapons are truth and silence. And I had both. Mr. Crane hesitated. For a moment it was so slight I almost missed it, a flicker in his eyes, a subtle shift in the way he held the papers. Then he cleared his throat again, adjusting his glasses with fingers that seemed to tremble just barely. "There's one more item," he said, slowly, carefully choosing each word. "A confidential letter. Only for Rowan." The words sliced through the room like ice water. The laughter stopped. The smirks evaporated. Even the tapping of my mother's perfectly manicured nails went still. For a few heartbeats, no one moved. Then my father's expression hardened. His grin fell away, replaced by something colder. He leaned back, arms crossed, his jaw tight. My mother's lips parted, the color draining from her face. Miles straightened in his chair, blinking as if he'd misheard. A letter, my father echoed, his voice low, sharp. For her, Mr. Crane nodded. Yes, it was Mr. Jonathan Ellis's express instruction. The contents are private and intended solely for Rowan. I could feel every eye in that room drilling into me, burning holes through my skin. Suspicion, curiosity, maybe even fear. For people like them, people who built their identities on control, uncertainty was the one thing they couldn't bear. My heart pounded so loud I could barely hear myself think. But I stood, slowly, deliberately. "Where is it?" I asked, my voice calm, far calmer than I felt. Mr. Crane gestured toward a side door. "If you'll come with me, Miss Ellis." I didn't glance at my parents as I moved. I kept my eyes forward one step at a time, aware of the hush that settled behind me, the buzzing whispers beginning to stir. I knew how this looked to them. I could imagine the calculations racing through my father's mind, the cold fury simmering in my mother's veins. But I didn't stop. I didn't flinch. We stepped into a smaller office, the door closing softly behind us. The air was different here, cooler, quieter, like stepping into another world entirely. The heavy weight of generations and judgment seemed to lift just slightly. On the desk sat an envelope, cream-colored, thick, sealed with a deep red wax stamp embossed with a small, barely visible symbol, a camera. I stopped breathing. Mr. Crane spoke in a gentler tone. "Your grandfather was very specific about this. He instructed me not to read it. It's meant for your eyes only." I nodded, but my hands trembled as I reached for the envelope. My fingertips brushed the paper, and something about the texture, the weight of it, made my chest tighten. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My grandfather's careful looping script. My name. Rowan. I swallowed hard, the room spinning slightly around me. Memories flashed: his voice, his rare smiles, the quiet afternoons where he'd ask me about my work, my life, in a way no one else in the family ever had. And yet, this a letter, a secret. I looked up at Mr. Crane. "Is there anything I should know before I open it?" He shook his head. "Only this: your grandfather wanted you to have the truth." I let out a shaky breath, sat down slowly. My fingers traced the edges of the wax seal, the tiny camera emblem pressing into my thumb. The truth. Something in me shifted in that moment, a quiet certainty, sharp as glass. Whatever was inside this envelope, it would not just change me. It would change everything. I pressed my thumb against the wax, and somewhere deep down, I knew my family's laughter was over. Their smirks, their certainty, their power. None of it would survive what was about to come. The weight of the envelope in my hand pulled me back to memories I had spent years trying to bury. You see, I wasn't always this composed. I wasn't always this still. I grew up in a house where silence was currency and love was conditional. The Ellis name meant power, wealth, and appearances. Nothing more, nothing less. My mother, Vivian, was the kind of woman who never raised her voice because she didn't need to. Her sharp glances and colder silences cut deeper than any scream ever could. She was beauty polished to perfection. Her world revolved around gayless silent auctions and meticulous control over every detail, including her children. But I was never her kind of child. I remember being 6 years old, standing in the grand hallway of our house, the one with marble floors so cold it made my toes ache, and showing her a crayon drawing I had made. It was clumsy and colorful, but it was mine. She didn't even look down. She simply murmured, "That's sweet, darling." But maybe next time something more elegant. I didn't understand then, but I do now. My father, Gregory Ellis, was a different kind of cold. He was a titan in finance, ruthless, brilliant, and utterly detached. To him, life was a balance sheet. People were assets or liabilities. I don't think he ever really saw me at all. He saw potential untapped, unwanted, and dismissed it without hesitation. He used to say, "In this family, emotions are expensive mistakes. We invest in results, not feelings." And then there was Miles, my older brother, the golden child, the heir. From the moment he was born, he was everything I wasn't. Athletic, charming, effortlessly composed. He knew how to play the game, how to smile at the right people, say the right words, make our parents beam with pride. He wasn't cruel, not outright, but he never stood between me and the quiet, relentless erosion of who I was either. At school functions, I was the quiet one at the edge of the photographs. At family dinners, I was the one whose voice trailed off before it could finish a sentence. I learned early invisibility was safer. But I never stopped creating, never stopped seeing the world in ways they couldn't or wouldn't understand. I carried a notebook everywhere. I scribbled poems on napkins. I borrowed an old camera from a teacher and spent hours capturing shadows, broken things, forgotten corners of the city. They called it a phase, a distraction. When I was 16, I told my parents I wanted to apply to art school. The silence that followed felt like an earthquake. My father's eyes narrowed. He set down his glass of scotch and said, without even looking at me, "That's not a profession, Rowan. That's a hobby for people who can afford to fail." My mother smiled tightly. "Your grandfather will be so disappointed, and I imagine so will we." Those words, so soft, so lethal, branded themselves into me. I remember going upstairs that night, locking my bedroom door, and sitting on the floor for hours, knees pulled to my chest, staring at nothing. That was the first time I realized they weren't going to love me differently. Not ever. But even then, something inside me refused to break. I moved out when I was 20. No inheritance, no help, just a scholarship and the worn-out Canon camera I bought secondhand. I worked 3 jobs, slept 4 hours a night, but I built something. Slowly, stubbornly, I built a life that was mine. I thought I had escaped them. I thought I had finally outrun the weight of the Ellis name. But life has a way of pulling you back to the places you least want to go. And so there I was years later, holding an envelope sealed by the only person in my family who had ever seen me not as a failure, not as an embarrassment, but as me. I ran my thumb over the wax seal, my heart pounding again. The memory swirled sharp as glass, and for the first time in a long time, I realized maybe I wasn't the outsider after all. Maybe I was the one who had never belonged, because I wasn't meant to inherit the poison they called legacy. I was meant to inherit something else entirely. But not everyone in my family saw me as an afterthought. There was one person, just one who looked past the surface, who didn't seem to care that I wasn't polished enough, strategic enough, or ruthless enough to fit the Ellis mold. My grandfather, Jonathan Ellis. To the world, he was a legend, a self-made titan who built the Ellis empire from nothing but grit, brilliance, and an iron will. To most people, he was untouchable, sharp, intimidating, respected. But with me, he was something different. I remember the first time he really looked at me. I was 11. It was the kind of autumn day where the air smelled like old leaves and wood smoke, and the adults were all gathered in the drawing room, sipping cocktails while I sat alone on the back steps with a sketchbook in my lap. I had drawn a crumbling brick wall from memory, a place I had seen near the docks. The lines were rough, the proportions slightly off, but it was mine. He found me there without warning. His footsteps were soft on the stone. "May I?" he asked, nodding toward the sketchbook. I hesitated, then handed it over. He studied the page for what felt like forever. Then, instead of dismissing it, he smiled just barely and said, "You have an eye." 3 simple words, but no one else in my family had ever said anything like that to me before, or since. From that day on, something shifted. Every time we were in the same house, he'd find me sometimes, only for a few stolen minutes, and he'd ask softly, "What are you working on now?" He never offered empty praise, never patronized. He simply saw me, the real me, not the disappointment they whispered about behind closed doors. When I was 15, after another disastrous family dinner, where my father had lectured me for lacking ambition, I found my grandfather in his study, surrounded by shelves of dusty leather books and half-finished crossword puzzles. I remember the lamplight pooling around him, the smell of old paper and cedar. He poured 2 cups of tea, one for him, one for me, and we sat without speaking for a while, just existing in the same quiet. Then he said almost casually, "The truth costs, you know?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" He set his cup down, folded his hands. His eyes, pale blue sharp, met mine. "Most people," he said, "aren't built to carry the truth. It's heavy. It changes you. Sometimes it breaks you. That's why people prefer lies. They're lighter, easier to hold." I didn't speak, I barely breathed. But he continued, "If you're lucky enough to see the truth and strong enough to survive it, then you must never, ever sell it, no matter the price." I must have looked confused, because he smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth barely lifting. "Never sell yourself short, Rowan," he said quietly. "Never trade what's real for what's easy." Those words stayed with me, long after I left that house, long after I built my own fragile life outside the walls of Ellis Power, long after I told myself I didn't need any of them. But I never forgot him. The last time I saw him was almost a year before he passed. I hadn't planned the visit. I was walking downtown after a photo shoot, cold and tired, when I found myself standing outside his brownstone. I don't know what pulled me there. Maybe some quiet thread still tied between us. Maybe something deeper. I rang the bell without thinking. To my surprise, he answered the door himself. He looked older, thinner, slower, but his eyes were as sharp as ever. He smiled when he saw me. "Well," he said softly, "a Harper, no, an Ellis who actually knocks." We sat in his study again. Tea, old books, the same quiet safety I remembered. He asked me about my photography, no judgment, no dismissive glances, just curiosity. I told him I was working on a series called Invisible Homes, photographing abandoned buildings and neighborhoods being torn down. He listened, really listened. And then he said something I didn't understand until much later. "Taking pictures of forgotten things," he murmured. "Dangerous work." I frowned. "Why dangerous?" Because he said, his voice soft, "You're telling the truth." And truth, my dear girl, is always more expensive than people think. When I left that day, he handed me a small battered camera. His first, he said, "Before the money, before the empire. Don't let them take your eye, Rowan," he told me at the door. "It's your gift and your rebellion." Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. And now, sitting in that sterile office with a sealed letter in my hand, I finally understood what he meant. He had seen the storm coming long before I did, and he had given me the one weapon my family would never expect: the truth. I sat there for a long moment, the envelope resting in my lap, my fingers trembling against the wax seal. My heartbeat was loud in my ears, drowning out everything else. The weight of it, the final words of the only person in my family who had ever truly seen me, felt heavier than any courtroom verdict or whispered betrayal I'd ever faced. I took a slow breath, pressed my thumb into the wax, and cracked the seal. The paper inside was thick, smooth, the ink slightly smudged in places, as though my grandfather's hands had trembled while writing. At the top, in his careful looping script, was my name: "My dearest Rowan. If you are reading this, then I am gone. I wish I could deliver these words in person, but life rarely grants us such luxuries. There are truths that must now be yours alone to carry." I swallowed hard, already sensing the weight of what was coming. You've always been different, and I say this with pride, not pity. In this family, difference is punished because it threatens control. From the moment you were born, I saw something in you that the others either feared or dismissed. Vision, integrity, heart. They were wrong about you, Rowan. And I was a coward for too long. I let them shape this family into something cold and cruel. I watched from within as it became machinery churning out power without purpose. I built it, and in many ways I destroyed it too. But I will not let it destroy you. I blinked, my throat tightening. My hands shook as I turned the page. I have left you something the others will never understand, because they are incapable of seeing beyond the surface. The Ellis Integrity Trust. It is real, and it is yours. Established quietly over decades, it holds not only assets, but the power to shift the very foundation this family was built upon. The others, your parents, miles they will fight over scraps, the houses, the stocks, the titles. Let them. I've left them what they expect, because I needed them to reveal themselves fully when they thought you had nothing. Only when people believe you are powerless do they show you who they truly are. And they have. I saw it in their eyes the day I told them I had updated my will. I knew what they would do. I knew how they would laugh. I needed you to see it too. I paused, the words blurring as my breath caught in my chest. This trust is not merely wealth, it is influence, it is legacy, and it is freedom. The documents are enclosed with this letter. The trust includes controlling shares in the Harper & Ellis Media Group, a silent partnership in Ellis Renewable Technologies, and a fund for philanthropic ventures under your sole direction. None of this is public knowledge. None of this is visible to the family. It is shielded by layers of legal architecture designed to withstand even their most vicious attempts to tear it down. I turned to the next page, my vision swimming. But Rowan, this comes with a choice. You owe them nothing. Not their approval, not their forgiveness, not even their destruction. This legacy is not about vengeance. It is about truth, about using what I leave behind to build something better if you choose to. But know this, if you let them define you, if you allow their disdain to shape your path, you will lose yourself as I once nearly did. Never forget, they only have power over you if you let them. I closed my eyes, the paper trembling between my hands. My heart was pounding so hard, I could barely draw breath. The man I thought I had known, reserved, distant, silent, had been watching all along, planning, protecting me in ways I never understood. And he was right. They had laughed because they thought I was nothing, powerless, disposable, and that belief that certainty was their fatal mistake. I set the letter down slowly. My fingertips brushed the edges of the sealed legal documents beneath it, thick folders, signatures, embossed seals that spoke of months, even years of careful preparation. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the afterthought. I was the axis, the center of something far bigger than money or legacy, a chance to reshape the narrative they had written for me since the day I was born. And in that small, quiet room, I made a decision. I would not tell them. Not yet. Let them smirk. Let them mock. Let them cling to the illusion that I was still the girl on the outside looking in. Because soon, very soon, they would understand. Not through screams, not through war, but through something far more devastating. Silence and the truth. I set the letter down, my fingertips still grazing the edge of the thick legal folders beneath it. My breath caught as I reached for the next envelope, smaller, heavier. Somehow its flap sealed, but not with wax. I could tell immediately this one wasn't about legacy. It was about truth. Inside, I found the documents, page after page meticulously printed, annotated in my grandfather's own steady handwriting. At first, I didn't understand what I was looking at. Financial statements, transaction records, private ledgers. But as I flipped through each page, the shape of the betrayal emerged slowly, sickeningly. It wasn't just that my father had manipulated the family's wealth. He had bled it dry. Over 15 years, Gregory Ellis, my father, had systematically siphoned money from charitable trusts, family investments, and worst of all, from accounts in my mother's name. He had shifted funds through shell companies' offshore holdings and fake endowments that appeared philanthropic on the surface, but in reality fed into his own private accounts. Tens of millions. Gone. I stared at the numbers, my stomach twisting into knots. I could hear his voice in my head, calm, dismissive, always in control. In this family, we invest in results, not feelings. It wasn't just numbers on a page. It was years, decades of deceit. My mother's assets drained without her knowledge. Charities that never saw a single promised dollar. Business partners betrayed. All of it, hidden beneath the glossy veneer of Ellis respectability. I turned to the last page. My grandfather's handwriting appeared again, neat and deliberate. Rowan, the truth is power, and power without conscience becomes poison. You must decide to expose or to endure. Only you can choose which legacy to carry. I let the paper fall from my hands. My vision blurred. My hands trembled. The weight of all of it pressed down on my chest until I could barely breathe. My father, the man who had told me my dreams were worthless, who had laughed when I spoke of building something of my own, who had looked at me as though I was an embarrassing footnote in the story of his success. And this was who he really was: a thief, a liar, a man who didn't just betray strangers or business partners, but his own wife, his own blood. I sat there in the quiet of that small office, my mind spiraling. Every memory rewrote itself. Every cold glance, every dismissal, every tight smile suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. But then the question: what was I going to do with it? The power to ruin him publicly, legally, utterly, was right there in my hands. I could expose the fraud. I could strip away everything he built. I could make them all see what I had always known, that he was a hollow man built on lies. And yet, part of me hesitated, because this wasn't just revenge. It wasn't just personal. It would mean war, public disgrace, legal battles, the family name already fragile shattered completely. The collateral damage could be enormous. My mother, my brother, the people who worked for our companies, lives beyond the Ellis name could be destroyed in the fallout. And still, how could I stay silent? I thought of my grandfather's words: "You must decide." I closed my eyes. The weight of choice settled over me like a second skin. I could feel both paths pulling me, one toward destruction, one toward preservation. Both carried cost. Both carried risk. And for the first time in my life, I realized this wasn't just about me. It was about justice, about truth, about becoming the woman I had always been too afraid to fully become. I opened my eyes. My hands steadied. I wasn't going to rush. I wasn't going to scream. But I wasn't going to walk away either. Not this time. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one they thought would stay silent. And I was done being silent. I couldn't sleep that night. Even after I left the law office, the letter and documents locked safely in my bag, my mind kept spiraling. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw numbers, signatures, the flicker of my father's smug grin, and my grandfather's handwriting, steady, unshakable. I knew I couldn't face this alone. The very next morning, I made the first move. I reached out to an old friend from law school, Evan Blake, someone I trusted. Evan wasn't just any attorney. He specialized in corporate fraud and financial crime. More importantly, he wasn't afraid to take on the powerful. He met me in a quiet cafe far from the polished halls my family frequented. I slid the documents across the table. He scanned them in silence, his eyes narrowing, his jaw tightening. "This is serious," he murmured finally. "This isn't just internal mismanagement, Rowan. This is criminal." I nodded. "I need everything verified, discreetly, and I need to know how far this goes." For a moment he hesitated. "You're talking about your own family." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I said, my voice steady. "And I'm not backing down." Within days, Evan assembled a small team: financial analysts, investigators, legal experts. We worked in secret. I took time off from my regular caseload, slipping quietly through the days, while my parents remained blissfully unaware. And then came the hardest part, meeting the people my father had hurt. The first was an elderly couple, Joseph and Marianne Carter. They had invested their retirement savings into a safe development fund my father had promoted at a charity gala. The fund never existed. They lost everything. When I sat in their modest living room, surrounded by faded photographs and hand-sewn curtains, Marianne's eyes filled with quiet grief. "We trusted him," she whispered. "He told us it was for the community, for our grandkids' future." I couldn't speak. All I could do was nod and listen, my hands clenched tightly in my lap. The second was a single mother, Clara Bennett. My father had convinced her to invest her late husband's insurance payout into one of his green tech projects. Another sham. Clara now worked 3 jobs to keep a roof over her kids' heads. She looked at me carefully when we met. "I don't understand," she said softly. "Why are you helping me?" I met her eyes. "Because I know what it feels like to be lied to by someone you should have been able to trust." Each meeting chipped away at something inside me. With every story, every face, the weight of what my father had done grew heavier. This wasn't abstract anymore. It wasn't just numbers on a page. It was lives. It was dignity stolen, futures destroyed. I filled notebooks with details, cross-referenced accounts. Evan's team dug deep, confirming everything. Offshore accounts, false charities, fabricated investment arms. It was worse than I had imagined. And yet, I kept going. I remembered my grandfather's words. "Only when people think you are powerless do they show you who they truly are." That thought kept me upright when the fatigue set in, when doubt crept in late at night. Because the deeper I dug, the clearer the choice became. This wasn't just about me anymore. This wasn't about proving I belonged. It was about stopping something toxic, about finally standing between the harm and the harm doer. One night, I found myself alone in the small studio I rented for my photography. The walls were bare, the only light coming from the lamp above my desk. I spread the evidence across the table: financial reports, witness statements, legal memos. It looked like chaos, but to me it was a map. Every line, every number, every signature told a story of greed, a story of betrayal. And maybe if I found the courage, a story that could end differently. I stared at the mess in front of me and took a breath so deep it made my ribs ache. I wasn't the girl in the corner anymore. I was the one holding the match, and I knew exactly what needed to burn. I don't know what I expected when I decided to tell her. Maybe I thought she would deny it. Maybe I thought she'd defend him like she always had, like she had my entire life. But something deep inside told me I had to try, that if anyone deserved to know the truth, it was her. I called my mother on a Thursday afternoon. Her voice when she answered was cool as ever. "Rowan," she said, polite, distant. "This is a surprise. We need to talk," I told her. "In person." There was a long pause. Then carefully she said, "All right." We met at her favorite tea room downtown, white linen, crystal glasses, soft piano music drifting in the background. The kind of place where appearances mattered more than anything. She wore pearls, of course. She always did. Her hair perfect, her hands resting gently on the tablecloth, as if we were discussing charity work or someone else's scandal, not the unraveling of her life. I slid the folder across the table without preamble. "I need you to read this." She frowned. "What is this? Just read." Her fingers hesitated. Then she opened the folder. I watched her face as she skimmed the first page. The slight narrowing of her eyes, the way her lips pressed tighter together with each line. Page by page, she kept reading. Her hands remained steady, always steady, but I saw it. The tiniest tremble at the corner of her mouth, the breath she forgot to take. When she finally looked up, her eyes were different. Not cold, not sharp, just empty. "Where did you get this?" she asked softly. "Grandfather left it for me," I said, "along with the legal documents for the Ellis Integrity Trust." He knew. He saw it. She blinked slowly. The accounts? The charities? I nodded. The offshore funds, the fake investments. He's been siphoning money for years, through your name too. For a moment she said nothing. Her gaze drifted somewhere beyond me into the space between memory and denial. I recognized the look because I'd worn it myself for so long. You knew, I murmured quietly. Didn't you? On some level? You knew something wasn't right. Her eyes flickered. I suspected she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. But I told myself it wasn't my place. Your father. He built everything. He provided. I thought. She stopped. The words trailed off. She looked down at her hands. I had never seen her like this. For the first time in my life, Vivian Ellis looked small, not in stature, in spirit. There was no polished mask, no carefully curated expression, just a woman staring into the wreckage of her own choices. I exhaled slowly. I'm not showing you this to punish you. I'm showing you because you deserve to know. Because you were used too. Her eyes lifted to mine, and something shifted between us. For years, I had seen her as an accomplice, as part of the machine that crushed me into silence. But sitting there across from her, I realized the truth was more complicated. She was as much a product of this family's rot as I was. Her hands finally closed the folder. She sat back, the lines around her eyes deeper than I remembered. What will you do? She asked. I'm not sure yet, I admitted. But I'm not walking away. For the briefest moment, a flicker of something fragile crossed her face. Pride, regret, fear, I couldn't name it. But when she spoke, her voice was different, softer. Do what you need to do, she said. The words caught me off guard. No protest, no defense, no carefully veiled manipulation. Just that. We sat in silence for a while. The piano played on. The clink of distant teacups filled the air. But neither of us moved to leave. In that moment, we weren't mother and daughter locked in old patterns of disappointment. We weren't enemies. We were something else. Two women. Two versions of survival. And for the first time in my life, we were quiet allies. I left the tea room without looking back. But her voice stayed with me. Do what you need to do. And for the first time, I knew I would. After that meeting, something in me settled. Not in the sense of peace, no, not yet, but in the sense of purpose. I knew what I had to do. The first step was Newberry Gallery. It wasn't the most famous gallery in Boston, but it had history. The building itself was an old brick structure on a quiet corner, its high ceilings and massive windows, once home to textile merchants before becoming a haven for artists. I'd exhibited there once years ago when I was still unknown, still hopeful, back when art was the only place I felt I existed. I bought the gallery quietly through the trust my grandfather had left me. No fanfare, no headlines. Just a signature, a wire transfer, and suddenly I held the keys to a space that would become more than just a gallery. It would become the battleground. For weeks, I worked in silence. Every day I visited the empty space, walking the creaking floors, tracing my fingers along the chipped brick walls. I could almost hear the echoes of what was to come. I designed every detail myself. I chose the lighting soft but deliberate. I selected every photograph that would line the walls, images I had taken over the years of forgotten places, abandoned homes, the quiet dignity of people the world never bothered to see. Each piece told a story of erasure, of survival, of resilience. At the heart of the space, I reserved a single plinth, empty for now, where the $10 check would sit, framed, lit like a relic. It was more than an exhibit. It was a statement, a mirror for them, a confession for me. I printed the invitations on thick ivory stock, minimalist, elegant, just 3 lines embossed in Silver Harper Light Studio presents The Inheritance of Vision by invitation only. I sent them to critics, journalists, donors, and I sent them personally to my family. One to my father, one to my mother, one to Miles. I didn't expect them to come. Not really. But curiosity is a powerful thing. And people like them, people who build their lives on perception, cannot resist the chance to control the narrative. I made sure the guest list included everyone who mattered: investors, influencers, voices who would carry the story far beyond the walls of that gallery. The press release, carefully worded, spoke of legacy of unseen voices of the intersection between art and justice. No names were mentioned, but the undercurrent was unmistakable. This wasn't just an exhibit. It was the beginning of an unveiling. Each day as the opening drew closer, I felt the tension coil tighter inside me. Nights blurred into mornings. My hands trembled sometimes when I framed the photographs, but I kept moving, kept breathing, kept building. The night before the opening, I stood alone in the gallery. The lights were dimmed. The walls were ready. The plinth stood at the center waiting for the frame check. My past, my present, my war all converging in this space. I pressed my hand against the glass of the largest frame. My fingertips left a faint smudge, and for the first time in years, I smiled, small, quiet, but real. Because I wasn't afraid anymore. The truth was coming. And this time, I would be the one holding the light. The night arrived quietly, the way all important moments do. I stood alone in the gallery before the doors opened, my fingertips resting on the edges of the final frame. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and polished wood. The lighting was soft, deliberate, casting long shadows across the floorboards. My heart thudded in my chest, steady but heavy, like I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't quite name. The Harper Light Studio was no longer just a gallery. It was a stage. By 7:30, the guests began to arrive. Slowly at first, critics, collectors, a few familiar faces from the city's art circles. Cameras flashed gently. Glasses of champagne clinked in the background. The room filled with low, polite conversation. From the outside, it looked like any other curated evening of polished civility. But I knew better. Every wall told a different story. The first series of photographs drew people in quietly. Black and white images of forgotten homes, boarded windows peeling paint, empty chairs left in the ruins of places time had abandoned. No captions, just shadows and light. The second series deepened the cut portraits of people the world had discarded. Survivors of financial abuse, economic injustice, systemic silencing. Faces lined with hardship, but eyes filled with defiance. I had met each one of them, sat across from them, listened to their stories. Their pain was real, their dignity even more so. I watched as the guests moved from frame to frame, their conversations, softening their expressions, shifting from polite curiosity to something heavier, something unsettled. And then at exactly 8 o'clock they arrived. My father, my mother, Miles. I saw them the moment they stepped through the door. My father in his tailored suit, his expression unreadable but sharp. My mother immaculate as always, her lips pressed into a careful line. Miles followed, his phone still in his hand, his eyes scanning the room with mild disinterest. They looked exactly the way I remembered, untouched, untouchable. But the room had already begun to turn against them, though they didn't know it yet. I stayed near the far wall, half-shadowed, watching as they moved through the exhibit. I saw the first flicker of confusion on my father's face as he studied one of the portraits. My mother's brow furrowed as she paused in front of the second series. Miles whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. And then they reached the centerpiece, the plinth, the $10 check, framed in glass, lit like a masterpiece. For a moment, none of them moved. My father's face tightened. My mother's fingers twitched at her side. Miles tilted his head, confused. The plaque beneath the check read, "Gifted to Rowan Ellis at the will reading of Jonathan Ellis, value priceless." And below that, in smaller print, sometimes the smallest inheritance is the greatest test. The room fell quieter as more guests gathered around, whispering, reading, piecing together the unsaid. Faces turned toward me now, some curious, some reverent. A few already aware, nodded subtly in recognition. I stepped forward at last. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor was sharper than I expected. My pulse pounded, but I kept my breathing steady. I didn't address them directly. Not yet. Instead, I turned to the small podium near the center, cleared my throat, and let my voice carry across the room. "Thank you all for coming," I began. This exhibit, The Inheritance of Vision, was born from a single idea: that not all legacies come in the form of wealth or titles. Some come in the form of truth, of seeing what others refuse to see, of telling the stories others work to silence. I let my eyes drift across the crowd, let them settle briefly on my family. My father's clenched jaw, my mother's frozen stillness, Miles's narrowed eyes. "These photographs are more than images," I continued. "They are windows into what is often left unseen, the quiet devastation of betrayal, the resilience of those cast aside, the power that lies in refusing to be erased." I paused. Let the words settle. Tonight is not just about art. It is about visibility. It is about choice. The applause came soft at first, then louder. I stepped back, but I didn't look away from them. My father's expression had shifted now, his eyes dark, calculating. My mother's hands trembled faintly, though her face remained composed. Miles looked lost for once, not knowing which side to take. The first move had been made, and though none of them knew it yet, the ground beneath their feet was already beginning to crack. The applause faded, but the tension remained, thick electric coiled in the air like a held breath. I stepped away from the podium, but I didn't retreat. I moved deliberately toward the center of the gallery, toward the plinth where the framed $10 check glowed under the lights. I let my fingers brush the edge of the glass. Steady, calm. I could feel my heartbeat in my fingertips, but my voice when it came was clear. "There's one more thing I need to share tonight," I said softly, but every word carried. The room stilled. Conversations ceased. Even the waitstaff froze mid-step. I could feel my parents' eyes locked on me now, my father's jaw rigid, my mother's breath shallow. Miles's confusion hardened into suspicion. But I kept my gaze level, my hands folded neatly in front of me. "A few months ago," I continued, "I received a letter. A private letter. From my grandfather, Jonathan Ellis." A ripple moved through the crowd. Many of you knew him as a man of vision, of legacy, but few knew the choices he made in the final years of his life. I paused just long enough to let their curiosity deepen. In that letter, I said he informed me that I am the sole beneficiary of the Ellis Integrity Trust, the true heart of the family's holdings, its assets, its influence, its future, left not to the traditional heirs but to me. There, I said it. A quiet gasp from somewhere in the back. Murmurs. Heads turned. Eyes widened. But I wasn't finished. More importantly, I said, my voice steady as steel, "He left me something else. The truth." I gestured gently, and the gallery assistant, who had been waiting for my silent cue, stepped forward and unveiled the final installation, a series of mounted documents framed under glass. Transaction records, wire transfers, ledgers annotated in my grandfather's own hand. I heard the sharp intake of breath from my mother. I saw my father's face pale beneath the golden gallery lights. These, I said, are records of financial misconduct spanning over 15 years. Funds siphoned from charitable foundations, fraudulent investments, money laundered through shell companies, all orchestrated by Gregory Ellis. The name hung in the air like gunpowder. Gasps rippled outward. Cameras clicked. For the first time in my life, I watched my father lose his composure. His lips parted, whether to protest or defend, I'll never know, because no words came. His face turned gray, his eyes darting to the documents, to the audience, back to me. My mother, always the portrait of control, sat down heavily on the nearest bench, her hands trembling in her lap. And Miles, Poor Miles stood frozen, his face drained of color, confusion, and horror mingling in his eyes. I took a breath. Not rushed, not cruel, measured. The trust I've inherited, I said, was built to protect the integrity of this family's legacy, not to shield the abuses of power that have defined it for too long. I turned toward the guests, not just my family. Tonight is not about vengeance. It is about accountability, about refusing to let silence be the price of survival. The gallery was silent. I could feel every pair of eyes on me, every breath held, and for the first time I felt no fear. I felt free. I didn't need to look at my father to know the damage was done. His empire, his control had been shattered, not with shouts, not with violence, but with light. The guests began to whisper again, soft, sharp voices carrying words I couldn't quite catch, but didn't need to. I had done what I came to do. The truth was no longer hidden, and nothing would ever be the same. For a moment, everything held still, and then, unexpectedly, it was not my father who spoke. It was my mother. She stood, slowly, deliberately. Her hands trembled just slightly as she adjusted the cuffs of her jacket. The gallery lights caught the gleam of her pearl earrings, but her face was different. It was the first time I'd ever seen her without a mask. She didn't look at my father. She didn't look at Miles. She looked at me. Her voice, when it came, was soft, but carried through the room with unnatural clarity. I owe my daughter an apology. The words dropped like a stone into deep water. A ripple ran through the crowd. The murmurs grew louder, sharper as people leaned forward, phones lifted, cameras blinking. The room moments earlier, a gallery had transformed into a stage. My chest tightened. I stood frozen, barely breathing. She continued. I allowed myself to believe, for too long, that silence was safer, that if I looked the other way, I could preserve something, status, comfort, the illusion of family. I was wrong. She swallowed. Her hands were shaking now, just enough for me to notice. I failed her, she said softly, and I failed myself. I caught my father's reaction in the corner of my eye. His face was a mask of disbelief, then fury. His lips parted, but no sound emerged. He looked like a man unraveling. But my mother didn't stop. Gregory Ellis, she said, her voice sharper now, turning toward him, does not speak for me. Not anymore. Her eyes met mine again. For the first time in my life, I truly saw her, not as the ice-cold woman who had shaped my childhood, but as someone who, in her own way, had been just as trapped. I am sorry, Rowan, she said quietly, for all of it. She sat back down without fanfare, without drama. The moment passed in a breath, but the damage was done. Gasps, shocked whispers, journalists scribbling frantically. Some of the guests had already begun live streaming. I could see the headlines writing themselves. Socialite Vivian Ellis publicly denounces husband, apologizes to disinherited daughter. I exhaled slowly, my pulse still pounding. I hadn't expected this. Not from her. For years, I had dreamed of revenge, of power, of justice. But I had never once imagined an apology. I didn't speak. Not yet. The room carried its own current, now the momentum shifting with a life of its own. And as I stood there silent, steady, I realized something else. This wasn't just my reckoning. It was hers, too. And in that moment, for the first time, I wasn't entirely alone. And then, like a dam breaking, everything erupted. My father moved first, his voice sharp and ragged, louder than I'd ever heard it. This is slander. He snapped, his face blotched red with fury. None of this holds up legally. This, he gestured wildly at the framed documents at the check at me. This is character assassination. You think you can humiliate me in public and get away with it? Miles stepped forward, his expression somewhere between panic and calculation. Rowan, this isn't you, he said, his voice pitched too high, the edges fraying. "You've been misled. You don't understand the complexities. I didn't speak. I didn't need to." My silence was sharper than any words I could have thrown. "None of this will stand," my father hissed, his voice dropping dangerously low. "You think the media cares about the truth. You think your little exhibit changes anything. We can sue you. We can bury you in legal motions for years. You'll lose everything." I met his eyes, calm, unblinking. I didn't flinch. For years, I had dreamed of this moment. I had rehearsed it in my mind 1,000 times, what I would say, how I would break him piece by piece. But now, standing there in the quiet of my own making, I realized I didn't need to destroy him. He was already destroying himself. The gallery guests had stepped back, giving the unfolding chaos space, but their eyes, every single pair, were locked on us. Cameras recorded. Phones captured every word, every gesture. The narrative was already slipping beyond his control. And he knew it. My mother didn't move. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded, her eyes distant, as if watching something already lost. The moment dragged on. Then, finally, I turned without speaking and walked away. The message was clear. I wouldn't engage. I wouldn't fight on their terms. I had spoken in images, in silence, in truth, and they had spoken in desperation. By the time I stepped outside the gallery into the cool night air, the first headlines were already breaking online. I could hear the distant murmur of my name on strangers' lips. I could feel the tide turning, and I knew this was only the beginning. The fallout came fast. By morning, the story had spread across every major outlet. Headlines splashed across social media. Heir exposes Ellis Empire's darkest secrets. Daughter unveils financial scandal in stunning public display. And then came the noise. Some voices called me brave. Others called me reckless. Commentators dissected the gallery exhibit frame by frame, analyzing every photograph, every word of my brief speech. Legal analysts speculated on lawsuits. Financial experts weighed in on the potential collapse of Ellis Holdings. But the voices that mattered most weren't the loudest ones. They were quieter, raw. Messages flooded in emails, letters, voicemails from people I didn't know. A retired teacher who had lost her pension to a fraudulent fund wrote, "Thank you for reminding me I wasn't crazy." A young single mother messaged, "Watching you speak gave me the courage to leave an abusive marriage I thought I couldn't escape." And perhaps the one that struck me hardest, a simple anonymous message, "You made the invisible visible." That matters. The debate grew beyond me. Talk shows and opinion pieces debated the meaning of legacy, the weight of silence, the cost of speaking out against one's own blood. Some called me a hero. Others accused me of betrayal. The phrase toxic family systems trended for 2 days straight. But I stayed quiet. I didn't grant interviews. I didn't defend or explain. I let the photographs speak. I let the truth settle where it would. At the same time, the people my father had harmed, those I had met, those I hadn't began to step forward. Their stories filled the airwaves, the Carters, Clara Bennett, others I had only known through legal files and whispered accounts. One by one, they told their truths. Each voice added weight. Each face added texture to the narrative. My father, for all his threats, retreated into silence. His legal team issued the usual denials. Miles disappeared from the public eye altogether. My mother surprisingly remained quiet too. I heard through Evan that she had retained separate counsel. A quiet divorce petition had been filed. But I didn't follow the details obsessively. Because for me, the story wasn't just about them anymore. It was about something bigger, something more enduring. I knew the media cycle would move on eventually, that the hashtags would fade. But the people who had written to me, the ones who had found a sliver of strength in my story, they would remember. And so would I. In the quiet of my studio, I framed one final photograph. Not for exhibition, not for press. It was the check, $10, a symbol of everything I had lost and everything I had reclaimed. I hung it by the window, and when the morning light touched it, I smiled, because in the end, this wasn't their legacy. It was mine. A few months later, the Harper Light studio looked entirely different. The walls still held my photographs, the ones that had sparked so much noise and debate, but now there was more life, more color, more purpose. We had opened the doors to something I once thought impossible: a residency program for survivors of financial abuse, economic manipulation, and coercive control. Artists, writers, photographers, people who, like me, had been silenced or made invisible in the currency of power and control. The Ellis Integrity Trust funded it all. I stood by the entrance on the first day as the first group of participants arrived, 8 in total. Some were young, some older, all of them carrying the same guarded uncertainty I had once worn like armor. One by one, they stepped inside. I saw it in their eyes, the flicker of disbelief, the tentative curiosity, the fragile hope. The program offered more than just creative space. It offered legal support, financial literacy, and above all, freedom to create without fear. I greeted each person by name, shaking their hands, meeting their eyes. No press, no announcements, just quiet beginnings. One woman, Sarah, mid-30s, with careful eyes, paused beside me as she looked around. "This doesn't feel real," she murmured. "It is," I said softly. "And it's yours as much as mine." She nodded, her lips tightening with unshed tears. In that moment, I understood this was the true inheritance my grandfather had wanted for me. Not the money, not the power, the chance to make something that lasted, something that healed. As the group settled in, laughter began to drift through the studio, soft at first, then louder, the sound of new stories waiting to be told. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. I didn't expect to see her again, not so soon. But one afternoon, as the autumn light filtered through the windows of the gallery, my mother arrived. No driver, no entourage, just her Vivian Ellis in a soft gray coat, her eyes shadowed but steady. I met her at the door. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she smiled, small, brittle, but real. I thought I should see it for myself. I nodded, stepping aside to let her in. We walked the space in near silence. She paused in front of the framed check. She said nothing, but I saw her fingers twitch the way her breath caught. Memory, maybe. Regret. Eventually, we settled in the small upstairs office. I poured tea without asking. She reached into her bag and placed something on the table between us. A simple ring, gold-worn delicate. Her wedding ring. I stared. "I thought I would never take it off," she said quietly. I thought I didn't have a choice. I looked at her, unsure what to say. She pushed the ring gently toward me. "I want you to have it. Not because I think you need it, but because I need to let it go." Her voice faltered just barely, but she steadied herself. For too long, she continued, "I thought survival meant silence, that we were born into roles we had no power to change. But you proved me wrong." I swallowed hard. I didn't know if I could ever fully forgive her. Not entirely. Too much damage had been done. Too many years lost. But something shifted between us, a quiet truce, not built on perfection, but on the simple decision to stop pretending. I reached out, took the ring. "Thank you," I said softly. We sat for a while, saying little, the past thick around us, but not suffocating. In the weeks that followed, the world outside continued its debate. Articles argued over the meaning of family loyalty, the nature of justice, the myth of inherited power. Some called me brave, some called me cold, others questioned everything. I let them, because in the quiet of my studio I knew the truth. Legacies are not built by birthright, they are built by choice, and I had made mine. I've thought a lot about legacy, about the stories we're handed, the names we're born with, the weight of expectations pressed onto our shoulders before we can even speak. We don't get to choose where we begin, but we do get to choose how we live. I stand here now alone in the quiet of the studio. The last of the evening light spills across the floorboards, golden and soft, catching on the edges of the frames that line the walls. The gallery is empty, but the air still hums with the echoes of what happened here, what changed here. I move slowly to the far wall where the frame check hangs. $10, my supposed worth in the eyes of a family that spent a lifetime teaching me how small I was supposed to be. I trace the edge of the frame with my fingertips. The glass is cool under my skin. This isn't just paper. It's proof. Proof that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money, or power, or property. It's the decision to stop the cycle, to tell the truth, to live differently. I think back to who I was before all this began, the girl standing on the outside, always watching, always wondering if I would ever be enough. And I think about the faces of those who walk through these doors, since the artists, the survivors, the silenced voices who found their way here, who are slowly finding their way back to themselves. They're the reason I kept going. They're the reason I stood my ground. The Ellis name meant something once, and maybe it still does, but not in the way my father believed, not in the way he tried to shape it. For me, it means something else entirely now. It means that silence is a choice, and so is speaking. We don't have to accept the roles we were given. We don't have to carry the weight of other people's lies. We can set it down. We can build something new. Even if we come from broken places, especially if we come from broken places. I take a slow breath and let it settle deep in my chest. I'm not who I was, and I don't need to be. So if you're listening to this, wherever you are, whoever you are, hear this. You don't have to wait for permission to live your life on your own terms. You don't have to shrink to fit inside someone else's version of you. Speak, even if your voice shakes, even if you've been taught your whole life to stay quiet. Speak for yourself, or if you can't just yet, speak for someone who can't. Because sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest truth. And sometimes the tiniest inheritance holds the power to change everything. I stand in the fading light, the frame check glowing softly in its place. And I know I'm free. Before we say goodbye, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee resting in your hands, or a late night where stories like this keep you company and give you something to hold on to? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to become part of a community that still believes in kindness and healing and in second chances. Thank you truly for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, I hope you carry this story with you. And I hope you remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly, patiently, until you're ready to open your heart. Take care of yourself, and we'll see you in the next story.